Ambassador Robert O'Brien, former national security advisor, also has held like a dozen different jobs in the government. He is now, of course, out in the West somewhere. I don't know where. Where did we find that picture of Robert O'Brien? You look like you're 10 in that picture, Mr. Ambassador. How are you?
Hey, I'm doing well. I'm actually in Manhattan, and I'm looking out the window at an orange sky. It's smoky, and it feels like a California wildfire, so I feel at home here in Manhattan. It feels California-esque with all the smoke.
Well, I want to talk to you about what China pulled on Saturday in the South China Sea, in the Taiwan Strait, actually. And I want to talk to you about how we get out of being dependent upon Taiwanese chips, though I like Taiwan Semiconductor. First of all, in your time at the NSA, did we deal with anything like a 150-yard crossing the T on two destroyers, one American, one Canadian? That was just, we've got video of that, and I'll play it. People can't believe it when they see it. Did you have to deal with anything like that in the Situation Room?
No, look, this has been going on for several years, going back to the early 2000s. That the Chinese have been trying to jostle us out of the South China Sea. Their warships aren't as technologically advanced as ours, so they've tried to make up for it with quantity and with aggressive tactics to push us out of vast swaths of the Pacific Ocean. I mean, these are international waters. The U.S. Navy sails in international waters. We're going to continue to sail in international waters. But the Chinese are now going to be more aggressive in trying to push us out, and they're going to use the quantities that they've developed, the massive number of ships that they've developed, to do that in a very unprofessional and unsafe fashion. But when I was there, they did not try and do that because I think they were concerned about how Donald Trump would react as opposed to the current administration.
Well, I heard that last night from my brother-in-law, retired Marine, who said, when Trump was in office, they would never try this because they have no idea what he would do. But this is truly dangerous. I mean, 150 yards is not much for two major capital ships to be separated by, is it?
No, it's not. I mean, and I want to commend the sailors on the Chung Hoon, the U.S. guided missile destroyer, and on the Canadian ship, His Majesty's Canadian ship Montreal, the frigate, handled it very professionally with skill and real maritime skill and avoiding this collision. But at some point, the Chinese are going to do what they did in the air. You remember in the early Bush administration, the Chinese jet intercepted a PC-3 Orion and forced it down. Fortunately, due to the airmanship, the pilot was able to land the ship, the airship, and save his crew. But then they were held hostage by the Chinese until we had to grovel and apologize and beg the Chinese to let our crew out and get our plane back. So something like that's going to happen at sea, and it's got the potential to escalate very, very significantly and dangerously.
So I'm going to come back to that. The moment that happens, people are going to start worried about their chips from Taiwan Semiconductor. And the Intel plant in Ohio isn't going to open for a while. What is the deal with our chip supply in the United States, Mr. Ambassador?
Well, look, 90% of our advanced chips come from Taiwan now. That's for the whole industrialized world. And so it's incredibly important that we defend Taiwan. In the meantime, we have to diversify our supply, and we have to make sure that we can build advanced chips. We've got a TSMC fabric being built in Arizona. We've got the Intel factory that you mentioned in Ohio. There's a Samsung factory coming online in Texas, but it's going to take 3, 4, 5 years for these to get up and running. But there's another issue here that folks aren't focusing on. We're talking about the advanced chips. The legacy chips are mature chips, which make up 80, 90% of any weapon system or car or dishwasher. We're not competing in that area, and the Chinese have realized that we're going to outcompete them on the advanced chips. They're trying to corner the market on the mature chips that they're used day in, day out, and they're actually supplying them to the Pentagon. So that the Pentagon is still buying these legacy chips and mature chips instead of from companies like Global Foundries and American companies. They're buying them from China, and so the Chinese are backdooring us on the chip fight as well. So we've got to be very, very careful when not just on these advanced chips like the TSMC chips from Taiwan, but also on the legacy chips.
Well, break this down for the Steelers fans, Mr. Ambassador. What's the big deal about buying legacy chips from China?
Well, look, the Chinese can put backdoors in all these chips and use them to either gain information, and we saw this with the ports recently when the port in Baltimore found out that the cranes that they were buying from China had sensors in them so the Chinese could gain intelligence on what was coming in and out of the ports from these chips in the cranes. But they can also put kill switches and that sort of thing in these switches and endanger the lives of our sailors and aviators who are relying on these chips for performance. If somehow the Chinese can use them to shut down a platform during a kinetic action.
So does the CHIPS Act address that as well? Because we should not be importing any technology from China because it's all dirty. Keith Krach used to come on here and still does, talks about the clean networks that you guys were building in the Trump years. Does the CHIPS Act address legacy chips or just next generation chips?
It addresses primarily the advanced, 2, 3, 4, 5 nanometer chips, the super advanced chips. We need to make sure that we use defensive measures. Look, there are plenty of fabrication plants that can make the legacy chips, and we can buy from those chip factories. And if we give long-term supply contracts to the companies that make them, they'll expand their production. So the idea that the Pentagon, especially, put aside a Ford Motor Company buying chips from China. That's one thing, not good, but one thing. It's a whole other kettle of fish to have the Pentagon buying these chips from China. It shouldn't happen. We should ban any purchase by the Pentagon of chips from China, and there is capacity, and we can get that capacity up and running very quickly on these legacy chips with American and trusted partners.
I'm in favor of not letting DOD. Is that going to be a rider in the appropriations bill? Because I don't want some contracting officer buying chips from China. That's like putting dirt in your washing machine. You're just dirtying up your whole system.
No, and you were right with Keith Krach. Did a great job on that with the telecom, systems and networks. We've got to do the same thing with the chips. So right now, unfortunately, Chinese chips are making it into products. They sell them to contractors, and the contractors turn around and sell the product to the Pentagon, and they contain Chinese chips, and we just can't have it. We've got to. There was an effort to put a similar ban that you're talking about in the last NDAA. It didn't pass. But we've got to make sure that it does.
Okay, now I want to turn, since I've got you, you're Mr. Tech, and you spend a lot of time thinking about this. When you're not, by the way, nicely done at the Nixon Foundation when you toasted the 50th anniversary of all the POWs from Vietnam. That must have been a very moving event.
Thank you. What an honor to be there with those 150 POWs. They're still with us from those days. They exhibited courage and determination, both physically and morally and spiritually in captivity. And they came back, and they just love this country, and they're the great patriots of the country. And it was a huge honor and a privilege to be there with them. It was a humbling experience.
Well, my hat is off to you. Now I want to go and turn to the artificial intelligence issue. And I talk about it a little bit, but the alarms are sounding all over the place. And you're always one to say, don't break our tech lead. Do we need to regulate AI, Mr. Ambassador, and do we need to do so quickly, or are you going to trust the market on this?
Look, I'm a market guy, and I think we need to trust the market. There's always a role for regulation, but I believe in light regulation. So we need to figure out, how do we regulate AI in a way that doesn't stunt our research and development, because the Chinese are racing forward. The Chinese are putting billions and billions of dollars into AI to close the gap, and according to some recent reports, they have closed the gap on AI, and the consequences of that are enormous. Take electric vehicles or autonomous vehicles, for instance, battery management systems, grid management, manufacturing. Those are all going to be determined by AI algorithms. So if the Chinese get the upper hand on that, we're all going to be driving Chinese electric vehicles in the future. So we've got to make sure that our corporations have the flexibility and the scale to compete with the Chinese. And then there are some things we need to do defensively. We've done some of that. We've barred some exports to China on AI, technology and equipment. But we also need to go on the offense. And going on the offense means funding our universities and research institutions the way the Chinese are doing theirs, to make sure that basic research that the companies aren't doing is being done by our universities to keep our technological edge.
Well, now you bring me to my reunion last week. We had a panel on China, Harvard law professor, Harvard business professor, Harvard undergraduate professor, and appeasement is the only word that fits. It just does. Everything is Trump's fault. Xi Jinping, he's going to be president for life, and it was an incredible amount of appeasement. And I'm wondering if you see that as much as I do. And I'm not sure I want to give money to the universities, because I think they're simply not awake to what's going on in the Chinese Communist Party.
Well, I think some of them are awake to it, and they're declinists. They believe that China's ultimately going to win, and they're trying to place their bets with China. You see it with a lot of Wall Street firms who believe America's in decline. They don't think that we can compete with this authoritarian Chinese model, and they bought into Chinese propaganda on that front. The bottom line is the American free enterprise system can compete with China, but we've got to come together as Americans and realize the challenge that's presented. And one of the reasons the Chinese have gotten ahead of us is because they're on the university campuses, pumping huge, millions and billions of dollars into American universities, and then taking the technology and the research, basic research that's coming out of those universities, trucking it back to China, and out developing us. And sometimes they use slave labor and low cost labor to do that, but they're also educating the Chinese, next generation of scientists here at American universities. And American universities are gladly taking the tuition money and the grants and that sort of thing from the Chinese. Wall Street and academia are totally corrupted by China and by the Communist Party, and they don't want that monetary lifeline to go away. And
did the CHIPS Act close the gap? It's trillions of dollars. Did we actually get anything done
with the CHIPS Act?
Yeah.
Yeah, the CHIPS Act look, the reason Mike Pompeo and I supported it is that, it smacks of industrial policy, and as Republicans, it's something it's an anathema to us, but that's going to allow companies, and we've already seen the effects. We've seen Intel and TSMC and Samsung and other companies, Global Foundries, building new fabrication plants in the U.S. So, look, it is a combination of some incentives to get companies to cut their sunk costs in China and come back home, or go to trusted partner countries, number one. And number two, it shows a commitment to the bringing manufacturing back to America.
Well, Mr. Ambassador, thank you for joining me. Stay out of the air in Manhattan this morning. Not a healthy place to be. Work out in the gym.
I'm giving a speech. I'm going to try and keep my voice in shape. Take care.
Yeah, don't go anywhere and breathe it. By the way, you noticed I've got the Fence Jumper, the book by your friend Mark Brandenburg. You saw it in my studio. I am indeed heading into the part of the year where I get to actually read books that are fun. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I'll be